After all this time, it is finally here, the last quarterly financial update of the Nintendo Switch era. We will, of course, still have Nintendo's annual report to investors next month, but as far as Nintendo eras go, things will never be the same again. Let's deep dive this report, see what's going on, which games have sold, what the numbers are like, which are the million-plus sellers, and try to see what interesting insights can be gleaned from the numbers about Nintendo's financial situation. Please do hit like and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on Nintendo's financial results briefing for the 2024 to 2025 fiscal year. Firstly, we have the consolidated financial highlights, and we can see, of course, that things are considerably down on the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year, with net sales of 1.1 trillion yen, down from 1.6 trillion yen last year. I have talked in previous quarterly reviews this year about the reasons why this is such a sharp downturn, but a significant reason is the fact that the combination of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and to some degree Super Mario Bros. Wonder turbocharged 2023, and 2024 just wasn't able to replicate anything like this. Therefore, while the headline figures are sharply negative, they're negative from an inflated starting point, and so I don't think it can be inferred that these numbers are in any way disastrous for Nintendo, despite the apparent negatives in the direction. For one thing, check out that net profit ratio of 23.9%, down from 29.3% last year. Historically, since the 80s when we have reported figures, Nintendo's profit share has never been higher than it was post-pandemic, and so this is a correction downwards. The lowest percentage profit share since 2019 to 20's fiscal year, when the number was a still historically rather high 19.8%, which of course was a year which ended with the arrival of Animal Crossing New Horizons just a few days before the end of the 2020 fiscal year. A few things to say here then. Firstly, Nintendo has had to increase the amount of spending on R&D, procurement and manufacture in anticipation of a launch that they're not actually profiting from in this financial year that we're discussing. Pre-orders, remember, were after March, which is the time window this document covers. A significant chunk of this profit margin is aided by the ahistoric exchange rate situation, whereby the yen is far weaker than other currencies, and so Nintendo is making big exchange rate gains on each purchase from abroad. Moreover, they clearly benefited big time from the fact that they had aging hardware with, in theory, although we'll discuss this, better economies of scale in terms of production, and they were able to rely heavily on already existing titles to sell as evergreen, while also capitalizing on long-standing investments in other revenue streams, such as the opening of more theme parks and the launch of the Super Mario Bros. Film. I'm not sure I would expect the net profit ratio to remain this high in the medium term, and it seems likely to me, maybe around 70% likely, given exchange rate changes alone, that it will dip by the end of the next fiscal year, without this necessarily being any kind of major hit against the company, which can and will continue to survive very happily. Consolidated sales is the next slide, and here we can see dips of around 30% across the board, including a 27% dip in the mobile and IP-related income bracket, almost certainly due to the lack of the film in this financial year compared to last. But also, hardware and software is decisively down, which is to be expected for the end of the Switch's life and given its rather bare-bones release schedule last year. Curiously, merchandise sales are up not just on the previous year, a 21.4% increase, but also significantly up on where this was not very long ago. 2.2 billion yen was collected in 2021 to 2022. So they are 6 times where they were 3 years ago, and this is only likely to improve. Nintendo is expanding its sales wing with the Nintendo Sales subsidiary being formed in 2017 from their takeover of JESNet, the Japan Entertainment Software Network. This may also reflect their ability to sell additional Mario-themed merch of the movies and through the theme parks. Still, it's a steady incline even if it's just a rounding error compared to the game sales, which account for nearly 100 times the other category of sales. This slide also gives us a breakdown of the regional sales ratio. The big story here is that the other regions are being squeezed, but the proportions remain broadly consistent with the trend over recent years of roughly 3/4 of sales being outside Japan, roughly 40 to 45% from the Americas, around 1/4 from Europe, and 1/4 from Japan. Interestingly, in their blurb, they do specify sales declined this fiscal year despite the continued weakness of the yen, affected by a year-on-year decline in unit sales for both Nintendo Switch hardware and software. The despite makes me think that this is a little bit of a sore point, since obviously the historic weakness of the yen was literally a golden opportunity for the company, and that they didn't capitalize on this moment might be something they come to regret, although in the broader context, given how well they're doing, I doubt that they can afford to be too upset. In the next slide, gross profit is mainly attributable to currency fluctuations, but what's interesting is the sharp decline in the first-party sales, with 73% of people buying first-party software, down from 81% last year. This isn't a huge surprise given the lack of any major sellers except perhaps Super Mario Party Jamboree, but it's still unusual for first-party sales to be this low. It was around 79% from 2021 to 2023, for example. Also, we see the inexorable rise of digital sales to 53.5%, up from 50.2%, although we will talk more about digital sales shortly. Their blurb also notes that although there was a decline in the proportion of first-party software sales, the gross profit margin increased by 3.9 points year on year to 61% due to factors including an increase in the proportion of digital sales and a decline in the proportion of sales for Nintendo Switch OLED model, which has a lower profit margin compared to other models. I am fascinated that more than 3 years on, the OLED's profitability is still an issue for Nintendo, as one would imagine that most production factors would have equalized by this point. To be fair, it doesn't say that it's not profitable, just that its profitability is less than the other models, to the extent that it makes a difference worth remarking upon in their financial statements. This makes me think that they designed the OLED before the chip shortage and were banking on the thing becoming more profitable over time when they set their price, something that doesn't seem to have happened, or at least not to the extent that they hoped. This might explain why they went for $450 over $400 for Switch 2, once bitten, twice shy, although I also suspect that Switch 2 will have very low margins for some time to come. Also, it does make me think that if one model does get the chop in the next couple of years, it's not necessarily going to be the original Switch, but could still be the OLED, as producing smaller quantities may just aggravate this price problem. But it also makes me wonder what the likelihood is of an OLED Switch 2. Clearly, the major difference between the Switch and Switch OLED is the screen. I know the kickstand and dock are higher quality, but I assume that this is likely to be a far more marginal difference in the cost. If a $50 markup was insufficient to stop this OLED model being a drag on the rest of the line, it makes me think an OLED Switch 2 could require a $100 bump, even disregarding other factors which could lead to an increased price, like inflation and tax. Actually, one other possibility occurs to me, which is that the 2017 Switch is actually more likely the 2019 Switch, as there were some extremely minor changes made that year. Therefore, it's likely that the sales profile of the Switch and the Switch Lite models would be similar in terms of profitability, as they can be claimed to have been released concurrently if you squint a bit, whereas the Switch OLED was, to be fair, released more recently. Just a theory. Anyway, let's press on. The next slide relates to selling, general and administrative expenses and discusses their operating profit. Perhaps the most significant thing to note here is that research and development increased by 4.4%, presumably reflecting costs for the Switch 2, although one would think that the design of that system was more or less completed by this fiscal year that we're discussing here. Also, we know that the Alamo came out this year, and it can be assumed that Nintendo will continue to have innovative new technologies over the coming years. Remember that the Switch was accompanied soon after by the new 2DS XL, Labo, and Ring Fit Adventure, and Nintendo has many more sources of potential revenue from their R&D activities, such as new rides in the theme park, and for that matter, they spent a lot over the last year on getting the Nintendo Museum ready. Advertising expenses were down 17%, small wonder, as they had little to advertise compared to previous years. Their operating profit is down 46.6%, shored up very slightly by a benign exchange rate, but we've covered profit earlier. The blurb for this text notes that selling, general and administrative expenses, SG&A expenses, increased by 0.5% year-on-year to 427.6 billion yen. Despite a decrease in advertising expenses, overall SG&A expenses remained largely unchanged due to an increase in personnel and R&D expenses and rise in yen equivalent foreign currency expenses due to the weakness of the yen. So while the weak yen has been very beneficial in terms of sales, it is less good when they're needing to spend in other currencies, such as on manufacturing a new system. Ordinary and net profit. Well, there's not too much to say on this slide. The loss of foreign exchange gains and the small foreign exchange rate losses possibly owe something to market turbulence, especially around August, and the exchange rate changes towards the end of the period. Still, despite the loss of income they appear to have had compared to what they might have done, the net profit ratio of 23.9% is still historically excellent, and I don't think Nintendo can have any complaints about their profits. In the blurb, they mention exchange rates issues, but I would suggest that these made a statistically quite small impact this year compared to some previous years when they have taken really swinging hits on exchange rate, such as during the early 2010s. Here, 7.9 billion yen was lost on foreign exchange losses, and that's bad, but this is taken against a net profit of 278.8 billion yen. Okay, here is where Nintendo Forecast meets Nintendo's forecasts. Nintendo are expecting a 63% bump in net sales this year, presumably driven by a vast increase in console sales due to the Switch 2, and yet their operating profit is only expected to increase by 13% and their ordinary profit just by 2.1%. As I understand it, the difference between operating profit and ordinary profit is that ordinary profit takes into account investment income and shareholder issues, so this hit seems to be reflective of a pessimism in the market conditions, largely, I would guess, due to the projected exchange rates. The fact that they are expecting the Switch year to be profitable shows confidence, but a 320 billion yen operating profit is actually well below where they were over most of the recent period, even during the period before the pandemic. 500 billion in 2023 to 24, nearly 600 billion yen in 2022 to 2023, and down now to around 320 billion yen now. That is the kind of trend we've been looking at. Now look, most of us wouldn't say no to a cheeky billion yen here or there coming our way, but the fact is that for a company the size of Nintendo launching a major console, these figures are quite conservative. They're not expecting to be up to the dizzy heights of the Switch's best days, but this will, if their forecast holds, be their strongest year since 2018 to 19, a year which, if you recall, had Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Mario Maker 2, and Super Mario Party, but really not an awful lot else unless you love the ports. Of course, even projecting that much shows that they have some level of confidence that this is not going to be a complete reset to the 2017 standard. They have momentum coming off the Switch despite the last year or so, and they know that they will at least get the benefit of the doubt with a strong start, even if maintaining those sales proves more challenging afterwards. What's puzzling is what the cause is of the lower profits. Is it that the margins on Switch 2 are much slimmer, which is always likely with new consoles, or is it more driven by pessimism about the impact of pricing changes on their major markets? At any rate, in the blurb, they do specify that they have used the 10th of April tariff arrangements as the basis for their forecasts. What's interesting about this to me is that if tariffs change, we will presumably be able to see how this affects their modelling. Obviously, a lot else would change in their predictions between now and that point, depending on system sales, but it would still be an interesting glimpse into their processes. As I've mentioned for some time now, they need to sell 15 million units first year, and 15 million is indeed their precise sales target for the next fiscal year. If Switch 2 has an elongated period on the market, 9 or so years, then if they can maintain 15 million as an average, with perhaps a bit more during its height, then they're well on track to be in the same broad ballpark as the original Switch. Doesn't mean they'll eclipse it, but Switch is a juggernaut, and much of its success was additionally driven by COVID. I have a separate video in the works on the long-term prospects of Switch 2, though. I do find it curious and frankly counterintuitive that they don't count software sales that come bundled with Switch 2. As they say in the small print, forecasted software sales units do not include the quantity to be bundled with hardware or other products, such as Mario Kart World software units included in Nintendo Switch 2 plus Mario Kart World bundle. I get that this is problematic from an accounting perspective, but I imagine that there'll be quite a lot of Mario Kart World sales through the bundle, and it will be interesting to see how these are delineated. Anticipated Switch sales are still going strong in Nintendo's view of things, with a 58.3% drop-off predicted to 4.5 million units. Now, this percentage is almost exactly consistent with the kind of drop-off seen in the later days of past handhelds like DS and 3DS, albeit with 3DS it had a bit of a late renaissance before the drop-off due to Nintendo's increased attention from the 1-2 punch of Pokemon Go and the Nintendo Switch announcement in 2016, plus the release of the new 2DS XL, which drove sales in 2017. I expect their flight path for the console will entail a similar 60%-ish drop-off the next year, which would still give it another 6 or so million units in its lifetime, and they are bullish on software sales, with 105 million Switch software units combined with 45 million Switch 2 software units predicted. Again, there are some accounting complexities with the Nintendo Switch 2 editions, but basically it seems like if you buy the Nintendo Switch 2 edition package, it counts as Switch 2 software, but if you download it, it counts as Nintendo Switch. Their blurb doesn't contain much new of note here, except an extra caveat about how there were management assumptions factored into these about foreign exchange rate fluctuations and other changes in the market environment, obviously tariffs being the most obvious in some respects, but I suspect broadly supply chain uncertainty would also factor in. All told, while this is a picture of the profits being down, I can't emphasize enough that they're down from a huge height, and the company is still in a very good place. I would definitely not anticipate the company returning to the glory days of the last few years for quite a while, if ever, given the market conditions, the exchange rate, and the difficulty of matching such a historic high point. But that doesn't mean it's going to be doing badly. Anyway, let's move on to their business highlights, and here there is a lot to boast about still. Firstly, we see that hardware was down from 15.7 million sold to 10.8 million sold between the 22-23 fiscal year and the 23-24 fiscal year. And this was, of course, under their original target of 13 million for the year, but not drastically under, all things considered. Also, while Switch and Switch Lite had a 22% drop-off, Switch OLED had a 37% drop-off. it is still the most popular of the three consoles, with 5.86 million sold, compared to Switch's 3 million and Switch Lite's 1.95 million units, but that's still a major drop. One video last year that went almost completely under the radar, but actually I thought was quite interesting, was one I did on Nintendo's holiday bundles, and it was striking to me there that they still had a good number of holiday bundles for the original Switch. Given what we know about the profit margins of the two systems, this might explain why they're deciding to push the original Switch a little more. Software is down from 200 million to 155 million, but we have some other highlights. First, Super Mario Party Jamboree scoops 7.48 million units. I had expected it to be the biggest selling game of the year after Super Mario Party crossed the 20 million threshold, but this is still a roaring start for a title which they can expect to have some degree of evergreen appeal, at least until another Mario Party replaces it in perhaps 2027 or so. The Jamboree TV add-on means I think we can expect Super Mario Party to cross 10 million pretty soon, but I don't quite know how they'll account for this in their games rankings, as it's both a Switch and Switch 2 title. I guess its Switch 2 exclusive sales may be underrated through this metric. It's incredible that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe still picks up 6.3 million in sales, but don't forget that there were a lot of bundles. Switch Sports with 3.16 million also was in bundles, notably in Australia, but I'm really delighted to see 4.09 million sales accounted for with Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Top-down Zelda games aren't always seen as megabucks projects, but I think this is really respectable, even allowing for the Switch's massive install base. From the way Aonuma was talking in the interviews around the time, he sees the current Grezzo team as continuing with Zelda for the long term, and if they can put in around 5 million consistently, then it will be well placed, not as the biggest franchise in town, but still a very significant. 15 Nintendo titles and 9 third-party titles scored a million sales or more in the financial year. We'll see what those are later. And there is also a graphic showing that the final quarter of the year was, as it always is, a steep drop-off. The post-Christmas period is usually rather bleak, but with just the two games, neither original, this January to March quarter was especially thin gruel. It's also curious that of the 1.26 million Switches sold in this quarter, nearly two-thirds were Switch OLED, up from an average of just over half for the year. Again, this makes sense if they were driving sales of the original Switch through bundles, and those bundles have now expired. It may also reflect the fact that the holiday market contains more potential purchasers who are going to be price conscious and may not be quite so interested in precise technical comparisons such as an OLED screen. Finally, I think Nintendo should feel really smug that they actually managed to beat the software sales in the last quarter of the April to June quarter last year. That quarter was also a rather bleak one in terms of games, with just Endless Ocean Luminous, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD coming out. But with the Switch even older now, it shows that they can still push software when needed. I also suspect, to be fair, that there were some sales at work here. I certainly noted a quite large number of discount deals being advertised to me from Nintendo to my email. It's also possible that these numbers may be revised if there are unsold copies returned, but Nintendo, by all reports, rarely has this issue, as they would tend to be, if anything, rather parsimonious with the amount of units produced, and besides, it would surprise me if this difference was worth hundreds of thousands of copies, although it is always possible. Their blurb here is interesting. They say, "To describe the sales situation for Nintendo Switch, we will use sell-in, which is unit sales by the Nintendo Group to its business partners. Although sales units of both hardware and software in this period were lower compared to the previous period, sales were stable given the fact that the platform was in its 8th year. Hardware sell-in declined by 31.2% year-on-year to 10.8 million units. The decline in hardware sell-in was greater for Nintendo Switch OLED model, partly due to a number of special edition versions being released in the previous fiscal year." End quote. Of course, while we know that there were OLED special editions such as for Tears of the Kingdom last year, it still seems likely to me that they made a conscious choice to big up the original Switch when they could have gone all in with the OLED. They also say that sales of evergreen titles were stable. The next slide focuses on hardware sell-through and annual playing users. Sales of the system follow the patterns we've seen, making almost a perfect inverted V in terms of the sales of Switch, with the sales decline arrested just slightly with 2022 to 2023 and the movie Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder contributing to a slower decline of sales that year. I still think that level of engagement is incredibly good, especially for such an aged system. They are clear that this involves accounts who use software one or more times during the year, but does not include eShop access or browsing. They also note that when the Switch is connected to the internet, usage data is collected. This means potentially if there's a million people who played a game when not connected but have yet to reconnect to the internet on their Switch, then that could mean that these numbers could reach last year's high watermark of 129 million still. All things considered, I rather doubt it, as I can't imagine there's that many people in that situation. To me, what's going to be really fascinating is what happens to these numbers over the next few years with the transition to Switch 2. Will enough people stick with Switch even if it's not being supported as a primary console, or will those consoles start to gather dust? First-party sell-through is next, and they specifically make a point of saying that Mario-related titles and other new titles released this year had solid sales. Now, it's true that Mario titles performed well, but they always perform well. I am interested by these figures, though. First of all, note that there's a difference here between the numbers reported earlier, as they're going off Nintendo estimates of final sales and not simply going with the amount provided to the retailers. Hence, Echoes of Wisdom is a bit lower at 3.7 million than the 4.1 million that was given earlier. These other titles may therefore be underestimates, and yet I have to say that these don't strike me as enormously healthy for newly released games by the standards of the Nintendo Switch. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD scraped 1 million, which is good, I guess, given that they literally dropped Switch 2 on top of it, but Luigi's Mansion 2 HD only got 1.6 million, and Mario and Luigi Brothership also just got 1.6 million, which in a way has to be disappointing for what was positioned as a quite big holiday game, albeit in a relatively niche series, and as the third Mario RPG in barely 12 months. I do wonder if the negative reviews of the title put people off, or whether this was just an inevitable decline in sales. Note that Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door also only got 1.9 million in sales, although this at least hits the number 3 spot for the year. It seems that by this point in the console's life, there are just too many other games to compete with, and none of these titles were sufficiently exciting to really have a vast early impact. Previously released titles also did well. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Switch Sports, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder were all pack-in titles, and I have to say that 2.9 million for Super Mario Bros. Wonder, while certainly very decent, feels relatively modest given that it was basically in every advertisement and it's far newer than most of their evergreens. I don't think they're done with Wonder, as it's genuinely a fantastic title, and I think that they will aim to give it a huge push, possibly as soon as this holiday season, with a Nintendo Switch 2 edition and a Plus game. 2.9 million is by no means bad, of course, but Super Mario Bros. Titles are usually very, very strong sellers. Look at the success of New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, which held on to the top 10 sales list for Switch for far, far too long, in my opinion, given the quality of the game. Then again, Super Mario Bros. Wonder released in a period where there were 6 Mario titles and 2 Mario spin-offs in the space of 13 months, so perhaps this cannibalized its sales a little. Animal Crossing New Horizons and Super Smash Bros. Hang in there with 2.5 million and 2 million in sales respectively, both decently respectable given that neither received any kind of particular push from what I can see. Their blurb here doesn't really add anything except picking up on the Mario angle again. This does make me wonder whether they are now starting to think of Mario-related titles as a separate category from the rest of their games. This actually ties into a fairly substantial theory video I am working on for later in the year, so I'll come back to this again another time. At any rate, Mario clearly has his own slide, and the 24 weeks after release sales for Mario Party games show a steady increase. We see that the cumulative sales of Super Mario Party from 2018 is 20.1 million and 13.6 million for 2021's Mario Party Superstars. They also can't help plugging, deep breath for this one, Super Mario Party Jamboree Nintendo Switch 2 Edition plus Jamboree TV. In their blurb, they also note that by continuing to promote the charm of Super Mario Party Jamboree to both people who are already playing the game and people who have not yet experienced it, we anticipate further growth in sales for this title. I've talked about Plus games before, and I have a quite long video coming which will delve into this even more, but I do think this statement of Nintendo's here could hold true for a lot of their hopes for the Plus games and Nintendo Switch 2 Edition title. Digital sales then, and we see that digital sales reached a huge quarterly amount. This is why, by the way, I cautioned people in previous investor report deep dives against taking these digital sales proportions too seriously. It's only once quarter 3 is factored in that the digital sales amounts start to reflect the true digital uptake for the year. Still, 62.9% is up year on year from 59.5%, though with a similar proportion of sales attributable to downloadable content like DLC, Nintendo Switch Online, and digital titles, and the amount that was earned due to downloadable versions of existing games. Because of all the Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades, I would guess that this figure will be artificially inflated going into the Switch 2 era, which will likely lead to headlines about how Nintendo users are veering sharply to the digital. And this may well be the case, and clearly over time that is the trend, but I think there's a lot of asterisks that need applying to this metric before it can be used too reliably. They also recognize in the blurb that sales for first-party software is recognized as gross sales, while sales of third parties is treated as net. This makes sense since obviously a lot of the profit from third-party games don't go to Nintendo, but it did give me pause to wonder whether there is any difference between the net and gross figures for first-party titles, and whether there would be effectively the same, or whether there are other factors that would make this measure artificially seem to bolster first-party numbers. I assume for all intents and purposes the figures are the same, as I doubt they would want to put out anything that could be perceived as misleading to their investors. And then we get the announced games. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, still undated and has managed to be on this slide for basically a whole console generation. Also of note is that Pokemon Champions isn't even confirmed for 2026, which is fair enough, as it's for the Pokemon Company to announce its date specifically, but shows the potential for a lot of further support for the Nintendo Switch beyond even 2026. They also say, going forward, we will continue to bring out new titles for the over 100 million people worldwide who are playing Nintendo Switch. Next up, a slide on Switch 2, which just recaps some of the previous announcements and talks about how on April the 4th, they began applications for the first round of randomly selected drawings for pre-orders on the My Nintendo store in Japan, and that they struggled to meet expectations. I have to say, rather than the randomness, I really do prefer the idea that they use your past play data, which seems to be the basis on which the UK ones were done. I know this isn't a perfect measure, but it seems at least reasonable as a way to infer people's likely hunger for the system, and is likely to produce an order of sales preference not based on pure luck, but at least on some kind of objective measure. Then we have a slide highlighting 3 key aspects of Nintendo Switch 2 for, quotes, enjoying games, specifically game chat, game share, and virtual game cards. It's curious that they've color-coded this and everything, and they clearly see these as significant pushes forward. What's striking to me here, though, is what they don't say. There's nothing about the potential utility of mouse mode or even how the new graphics will drive sales. Mouse controls do get a brief mention in the previous slide, and granted, this is an investor report, so they're not expecting their primary audience to be foaming at the mouth over the control opportunities presented by Drag and Drive, but innovation is still a core quality of Nintendo and part of their perceived value, so I am a little surprised that they made no apparent effort to tout their efforts to break new ground with this console. Then we get a reiteration of the core first-party software for Nintendo Switch 2. They note that they would like as many people as possible to enjoy the new Mario Kart title when the hardware launches, which, while obvious, is also curious wording. I think Zelda Breath of the Wild was a game that sold the system, but with Mario Kart World, it's the other way around. People will buy the system, but they really then want to get that attach rate high if the Mario Kart game is truly as good as the early reports and all appearances do suggest. There's also a very key phrasing in this next section. We also plan to release a variety of other titles that utilize the performance and new features of Nintendo Switch 2, such as Donkey Kong Bonanza. And sure, we knew about Donkey Kong Bonanza, but a variety of other titles. Well, yes, Drag and Drive will definitely utilize features, and so will Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour. Kirby Air Riders clearly uses the performance benefits of the Switch 2. Still, for those tipping a Luigi's Mansion this year, while my view hasn't changed from my video a few weeks ago on the topic, this will do nothing to dampen down those beliefs. Then we see a mighty 6 Nintendo Switch 2 Edition titles lined up, which is actually one more than the number of announced Switch 2 first-party exclusives at this point. Not much more to say here, except that there seems to be a real range in the art quality for this, from the Zelda titles and Metroid Prime 4, which have a classy Nintendo Switch 2 Edition scroll at the bottom, to the cluttered but charming Jamboree TV, to whatever is going on with the star-crossed world cover. I love Forgotten Land, but I hope they do something different with that cover before release. Then we get a view of the third-party lineup, which isn't really new for anybody who saw the April Direct, but it does say that software publishers are preparing a robust lineup of titles of an ever wider variety than they did for Nintendo Switch. Now, what on earth can that mean? An even wider variety. I mean, there was a ridiculous amount of Switch content, so while this may just be loose talking, it makes me wonder if they have something specific in mind. Mouse games coming over from PC, perhaps? It's a difficult one to actually justify, and I will be intrigued to see if they ever come back to this wording, or if anybody in the investor Q&As drills into it. Then there is a mention of their new IP initiatives with reference to the opening of the San Francisco store and their Orlando Super Nintendo World, both happening as it happens this month. For those worried about rare-style Donkey Kong, he is still visible in the promotions here, so if they're planning to celebrate Donkey Kong Bonanza by decapitating the Donkey Kong theme park animatronics and giving him a new, more synergistic head, there is no sign of such a move. Or not yet, anyway. They also promote the film and Nintendo Today. Nintendo Today has been kind of forgotten, and it's fair to say that much of the stuff on there in recent times has been fairly prosaic, but I maintain that it could be quite significant in terms of Nintendo's future strategy, and I definitely don't think we've seen the last of it. They talk yet again of creating point of contact with customers, and phones literally maintain contact as people button press through the apps. Next, we have a grid showing the sales breakdowns compared to previous years, with precise regional splits. Note that mobile and IP-related income has held steady in Japan compared to America, which is perhaps partly due to the huge impact of the Super Mario Bros. Movie in the USA. Illumination is, after all, a US company, but I also think may owe something to the continual presence of Nintendo IP projects in Japan, such as, of course, the Nintendo Museum. The other category seems to have undergone a loss of 40 million yen in the rest of the world. This relates to merchandise sales. Not quite sure why this should be, increased costs in these other locations, or perhaps they moved supply to the more profitable regions, and this is really just a product of accountancy rather than a significant loss in itself. Difficult to say at this point. The supplementary information contains a really interesting nugget though. 65,000 million yen is scheduled for capital investments, of which 140,000 million yen is given over to advertising, although their R&D expenses are still going up. I've talked before about how before Switch 2 launches, their focus will be on word of mouth campaigning, and I think the Nintendo Switch 2 global events are designed to promote this. But these incur some expenses themselves, and come what may, I think there is going to be a massive advertising blowout next year. They are planning to spend nearly double the amount on advertising as the 2023 to 2024 year. We can also see here the exchange rate that they're forecasting, which is bold of them. They reckon that the $1 will equal 140 yen next year, as opposed to 152 yen this year. This is pretty much the exchange rate that we saw in April around the tariff news and when it seems that this document was mainly being put together. They also expect the yen to strengthen against the euro, although slightly more modestly, probably reflecting the fact that the aim of the American administration in the medium term is to devalue the dollar. Then we have a breakdown of digital sales, which gives us a bit more of a forensic look at how digital sales, presumably digital exclusives, NSO, and DLC, compare with downloadable versions of packaged software. And this pretty much backs up what I said earlier about being cautious with the digital sales figures. Last financial year, 64.5% of sales of software were digital, but this was clearly inflated by the massive events of that year, which they seem to have successfully turned to digital sales over physical ones. I'm not sure if this means that an awful lot of Tears of the Kingdom players bought digitally directly or not, but irrespective, the rest of the percentages are broadly comparable. Yes, digital sales are up marginally, especially over the holiday quarter, where they're 56% up from 51%, but it's not quite such a surge as might be expected once you remove a few confounding factors. Another breakdown is given of the key indicators with proportions of sales outside Japan bibbling around the 75% mark all year, proportions of hardware sales only really spiking during the holiday period, and the proportion of first-party sales going down to 66.3% in one quarter last year. By Nintendo standards, this is really rough, but another way to look at it is that even with some incredibly quiet quarters for games, Switch is still a juggernaut in the first-party space. We also get granular breakdowns of sales by region of the different models, and we can see that while the OLED model trounced the original Switch in Japan, the original Switch was far more competitive elsewhere. 500,000 Japanese Switches were sold compared to 2 million Japanese Switch OLEDs. 4 times as many people in Japan chose OLED as chose the original Switch. In the Americas, though, it's 1.4 million for the original and 1.6 for OLED. A narrow win for OLED to be sure, but still quite modest. And this is where they did have both bundles available. Is this because of how they push the different systems, or, as seems likely, are American consumers more price conscious as Nintendo consoles are more of a whim purchase for them compared to Japanese consumers who are more likely to be dedicated to Nintendo? I may deep dive this at some point, but for now, let's move on to one of my favourite slides from these presentations. Nintendo provides a list here of their million-selling first-party titles for the fiscal year. Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp yet again, unaccountably, fails to make the list. We can see though that they reckon that they've got 1.27 million Donkey Kong Country Returns HD sales in the bag, which I guess is decent considering they arrived late in the year, and Tears of the Kingdom has now soared through the 21 million skyline. Animal Crossing New Horizons is on 47 million, but Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is on 68 million and surely has to clear 70 million in Switch's life. I believe back in the day Wii Sports had over 80 million, so it seems like a tougher ask, although of course if you factor in the Wii U sales of Mario Kart 8, then it would only need a few more million to at least be in contention. There's also the roll call of games and other products that Nintendo released in the year. It's sad that MEO didn't pass 1 million, but hardly surprising I guess given that it's quite a niche and dark topic, and as for Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, it only had a few days to get sales. This also means that its sales may always remain a bit mysterious, as if it scores just under 1 million over 2 consecutive financial years, it could end up not being reported despite closing in on 2 million in total. I hope, though, that the surely inevitable Nintendo Switch 2 edition will give this title a bit more of the push it deserves. Then there's a handy list of all the release dates coming up in one place for those of you who, through some kind of Pavlovian conditioning by Nintendo, need proof of life for Metroid Prime 4 at all times. There's also a list of supplementary info which has been updated, but I'm going to wrap up this survey of Nintendo's report now. If you missed my previous video on the changes to the directors, then do catch that. I'll pop it on the screen next, and I expect that I will have more commentary in due course, especially as the Q&A is translated. For now, though, thank you so much to the Patreon supporters. I appreciate you watching, liking, sharing, and subscribing, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.